How the 13 colonies tried and failed to convince Canada to side with them during the American Revolution. After peaceful attempts at alliance building stalled, the Continental Army launched an ill-fated invasion of Quebec in June 1775. A John Trumbull painting of the death of American General Richard Montgomery at the Battle of Quebec on December 31, 1775. The first governing document of the United States of America offered Canada a deal. Adopted by the Continental Congress in 1777, the Articles of Confederation stated that Canada, then a British colony, shall be admitted into and entitled to all the advantages of this union at any time, no questions asked. All other colonies that wished to join the nascent nation would have to get approval from 9 of the U.S.'s 13 states. Canada, of course, never took the U.S. up on its offer. Still, the proposal was no whim of statecraft. Instead, it was part of a prolonged effort during and after the Revolutionary War to convince Canadians to buy into a future free from British dominion. In 1775, 2 years before the Articles of Confederation offered Canada statehood, the Continental Army launched an ill-fated invasion of Quebec in June 1775. The goal, wrote the Army's commander, George Washington, in his Address to the Inhabitants of Canada, was not to plunder, but to protect you. Early successes for the Continental Army faltered in the face of a dramatic defeat at Quebec City's heavily fortified citadel on New Year's Eve, effectively ending the first foreign invasion by the 13 colonies, just months after it began. A depiction of fierce street fighting during the Battle of Quebec. In subsequent centuries, the failed Quebec campaign became little more than a strange and largely forgotten episode from the shaky first year of the war. As historian Mark R. Anderson writes in The Battle for the 14th Colony, America's War of Liberation in Canada, scholars have tended to relegate it to the footnotes because it does not fit comfortably in either country's national narrative. But the invasion of Quebec is anything but irrelevant to the creation of the U.S. and the formation of modern Canadian identity. As the 250th anniversary of the military campaign approaches, it's worth pulling the history back out of the footnotes. In their revolution. After Great Britain emerged victorious in the French and Indian War, a clash with France over territory in North America, in 1763 it faced a difficult task, managing Quebec, a sprawling former French colony where the Catholic majority had little in common with their new Protestant rulers. To heal the wounds of the war and streamline governance, the British Parliament passed the Quebec Act in 1774. The legislation's compromises were significant. The criminal law code became British, while civil and property law in the province continued to follow the French model. The act largely preserved Quebec's feudal land distribution system, and it allowed residents the right to freely practice the religion of the Church of Rome, so long as they stayed loyal foremost to Britain's king, George III. The act's most controversial reform, however, was expanding the official boundary of Quebec to the Ohio River Valley, which conflicted with prominent American colonists' property interests and their hopes of expanding on the western frontier. Many residents of the lower 13 colonies took the Quebec Act as yet another instance of ministerial tyranny akin to the Coercive Acts, which were passed that same year to punish Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party and other incidents of unrest in the city, as Anderson tells Smithsonian Magazine. A map of British America showing the original boundaries of the province of Quebec and its boundaries after the passage of the 1774 Quebec Act. This line of thinking goes some way in explaining why the delegates of the First Continental Congress wholeheartedly condemned the Quebec Act and Quebec itself in September 1774 as dangerous in an extreme degree to the Protestant religion and to the civil rights and liberties of all America. But just a month later, in what Holly A. Mayer, an emeritus historian at Duquesne University, calls a tremendous flip, the delegates started trying to court French Canadians to join their anti-British crusade instead. In a letter, the delegates impelled their friends and fellow subjects to join them in demanding self-government and other rights from their British rulers. Quebec, they wrote, was the only link wanting to complete the bright and strong chain of union. Where religious differences once threatened enmity, the delegates were now convinced that both sides were above all such low-minded infirmities. If Switzerland had Catholic and Protestant communities living in the utmost concord and peace, the letter's authors mused, so could the United Colonies, as the not yet independent proto-state was then called. The reason for this remarkable switch in attitude was the delegates' realization that having a heavyweight colony like Quebec on their side would amplify the American colony's protests against British tyranny. It would also mean that British troops couldn't crush the rebellion from the north. Exigency sparked enlightenment, Mayer tells Smithsonian Magazine. The letter ended with an invitation for Quebec to send delegates to the next Continental Congress, which was slated to be held in May 1775. But the request was untenable. In late March, John Brown, a diplomat dispatched to Montreal, reported in a letter to two prominent Bostonians, Samuel Adams and Joran Warren, that there was no prospect of Canada sending delegates. Caught between their British rulers and the excitable rebels, Quebec's residents, also known as Quebecois, chose rather to stand neuter. That position of neutrality largely reflected how effective the Quebec Act was in placing important guardrails up against dissidents in the province. It successfully placated the leaders of Quebec's religious, legal, and economic institutions, while also indicating to ordinary French Canadians that their rights and privileges could be best expanded under the slow but steady progress of British ministerial reform, not by joining the Patriots' fledgling revolts.
The road to war. The Patriots, on the other hand, had lost faith in reform or a peaceful resolution to their differences with the British. In April 1775, the battles of Lexington and Concord officially started the American Revolution, resulting dramatically in the Patriots' siege of Boston. While rebel militiamen pinned British troops in innermost Boston, their artillery couldn't pierce the city's British strongholds. In his letter, Brown had already advised that Fort Ticonderoga, a British stronghold located on the shores of Lake Champlain in northern New York, must be seized as soon as possible to defend against British incursions from the north. An illustration of the capture of Fort Ticonderoga. Despite being a critical juncture point in the waterways between the American colonies in Canada, the fort was often garrisoned with as few as 15 British regulars, a common synonym for redcoat at the time. Matthew Cagle, the curator who oversees programming at the Fort Ticonderoga Historic Site, tells Smithsonian. Because its long-range artillery was believed to be crucial for the liberation of Boston, the fort became exceedingly tempting to raid. Acting on Brown's intelligence, men led by Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen, including members of the Green Mountain Boys militia, just roared into the fort on May 10th and routed the British with no bloodshed, Cagle says. To justify the siege of Ticonderoga, as well as several impulsive raids conducted by the Patriots across the border in Quebec, without inciting outright war, the Continental Congress framed the events as dictated by the great law of self-preservation in yet another blustery letter to the oppressed inhabitants of Canada. We presume you will not, by doing us injury, reduce us to the disagreeable necessity of treating you as enemies, the delegates warned the Canadians. At the same time, Quebec's governor, Guy Carleton, amassed British troops at the nearby Fort St. Jean and tried, without much success, to draw Native American tribes and rank-and-file French Canadians onto the British side should an invasion occur. After the British victory at Bunker Hill in June 1775, the conflict between the rebels and the Redcoats rapidly expanded. Later that month, Congress authorized Major General Philip John Schuyler to establish a Northern Army division and investigate the possibility of invading Canada, especially if it can be done in a manner agreeable to the Canadians, a leading Virginia statesman wrote in a letter to Washington. The Patriots remained ever hopeful that Quebec would become a 14th rebellious colony.
To protect. Not long after giving Schuyler an army, Congress went into recess until mid-September. Skirmishes along the border ratcheted up the pressure to act against Canada, but Schuyler held steady, slowly gathering men, supplies, and intelligence at Ticonderoga for an invasion that now only he could initiate. In late August, Schuyler belatedly learned that Washington was preparing a second prong of attack, which would depart from Massachusetts and make its way north through the wilds of Maine and Quebec under Arnold's command. Around that same time, Schuyler was called down to Albany to help negotiate a treaty with a group of Native Americans, leaving Brigadier General Richard Montgomery in charge of his forces. Feeling pressured by Arnold's army, Montgomery launched the invasion in response to British ship activity near Lake Champlain. Without Congress to provide centralized planning, forethought, or follow-through, Anderson says, the invasion began on the basis of its own weighty anticipation and seemingly unstoppable momentum. That momentum carried Montgomery's troops up the Richelieu Valley and deposited them at the British Fort St. Jean. Starting on September 17th, the grinding siege of the fort lasted until early November, far longer than anyone expected. When it finally broke, the invaders had a clear path to Montreal. But winter was closing in, smallpox was spreading, and supplies were dwindling. The Northern Army was still on its own. Arnold's troops slogged through the mud, snow, and dense forests of Maine, making as little as 4 or 5 miles of progress on some days. Marched through hideous woods and mountains for the most part, but sometimes on the banks of the river, which is very rapid. James Melvin, a private on the expedition, wrote in his journal on October 21st. Supplies were perennially low. The men resorted to eating birds, squirrels, and even their own dogs. As they emerged from the unsettled woodlands, the troops found salvation on the French farms of southern Quebec. This evening, to our great joy, Melvin wrote on November 2nd, we arrived at the first French house where was provision ready for us. Friendly Quebecois furnished the soldiers with lodging and oxen, though whether this hospitality was the result of opportunism, genuine support for the invasion, or fear of the armed men is unclear. Not all locals were eager to join Washington's true-born sons of America, as the founding father referred to the Patriots in his address to the inhabitants of Canada. The invasion had quickly reframed Quebec's social divide. No longer was it new subjects versus old subjects, Mayer says. Instead, it shifted to fit the wartime paradigm of loyalists and patriots. Some Quebecois housed troops or joined pro-patriot militias. Others joined the British in firing muskets and artillery at the men invading their homeland and plundering their homesteads. With or without Quebecois support, the British continually failed to muster effective resistance against the Continental Army. In attack after attack, the British were caught on the back foot, unable to mount a cohesive defense, says James Taub, a curator at the Museum of the American Revolution. When Montgomery's troops menaced Montreal, Carleton abandoned his seat of governance at the Château Ramezay and gave up the city without a fight. This retreat, says André Delis, director of the historic site and museum at the Château, was a strategic decision for Carleton and the British, who regrouped to make a final stand in the capital of Quebec City. Montgomery kept on their trail, soon leaving Montreal in the hands of General Wooster and marching up the St. Lawrence River to meet Arnold. Wooster struggled to govern Montreal's divided citizens and often erred on the side of tyranny. A widely cited story suggests he ordered all Catholic churches closed on Christmas Eve on the ground that they were loyalist breeding grounds. But the evidence supporting this claim is scant. The easy takeover of the city cheered Continental troops into thinking that Quebec City, the last bastion of British control in the province, was but the final victory in an inevitable chain of conquests. Those early successes, however, concealed deep flaws in the invading army's strategy. The delayed launch of the initial invasion, coupled with the slow conquest of Fort St. Jean, and Arnold's slog through Maine, pushed the campaign deeper into the winter than intended, eating into supplies, morale, and time before the St. Lawrence thawed and allowed British reinforcements to enter Quebec. The Northern Army was a hollow shell, weak in numbers, decimated by smallpox, with troops yearning to depart the moment their enlistments were complete. Anderson writes in his book, with enlistments ending on New Year's Day in 1776, Montgomery and Arnold opted to force an assault on Quebec City as soon as possible rather than wait out the winter.
Fired on the Patriots. Congress, for its part, was all but absent in orchestrating the war effort in faraway Canada. Instead, the governing body focused on major battles in Virginia, South Carolina, and Boston, which was still under siege. Lacking a grand strategy for taking Quebec City, the siege scheduled for the early hours of New Year's Eve in 1775 fluidly morphed into what Mayer describes as a total and complete wreck. Melvin, the private in Arnold's contingent, recorded the logistical debacle in his journal. About 4 a.m, we were mustered in order to storm the town. It snowed and stormed and was very dark, he wrote. Our company had not timely notice of the attack, which occasioned us to be too late, for when the firing began, we had 1.5 miles to march. Almost as soon as the Continental Army charged Quebec City's ramparts, a British cannon blast killed Montgomery, his aide-de-camp, and about a dozen other men. Then Arnold's forces rushed in, and, once again, a shot from the fortress walls cut down their commander, who staggered away with an injured leg. "Don't give up! Go on, boys! Go on, boys!" Arnold reportedly shouted as his blood stained the snow, but his men were doomed anyway. Of the roughly 500 soldiers in his contingent, 35 were killed, 33 were wounded, and 372, including Melvin, were captured in the failed assault. Beyond these critical losses of manpower and life, it is difficult to overstate the immense strategic disappointment represented by the battle for Quebec City. If the Continental Army had been successful, Kegel says, there was little more to hold on to for the British. Instead, the Patriots had allowed Britain to regain a foothold in the province. The Empire's forces just had to wait out the winter as the Patriots slinked back south. Congress sent high-profile figures like Benjamin Franklin up to Chateau Ramezay to make further appeal to the Canadians, but these efforts were unsuccessful. The Continental Army retreated from Montreal and its environs in June 1776, after British reinforcements from the north began recapturing the province. Congress officially blamed the defeat on enlistment difficulties, a general lack of funds, and widespread smallpox, 3 politically palatable reasons that obfuscated real strategic failures and ideological missteps, says Anderson. Other duties, like fighting ongoing battles and declaring independence, were at least in part to blame for Congress's unwillingness to investigate deeper causes of the defeat at the time. But for some delegates, the reasons were obvious. In a private letter, John Adams enumerated 8 causes of our misfortunes and miscarriages in Canada, though he complained that the reasons were so numerous, of so long-standing, and of so incessantly increasing that it would take a long letter to develop them.
At the top of Adams' list was the diversity of sentiments in Congress, a general disunity about the aims and means of the invasion. While he acknowledged the role of smallpox, he also cited intelligence failures and poor planning for a gargantuan war effort. Still, Adams failed to outright ask the most important questions. Were Canadians ever willing to join the rebellious 13 colonies? Would an invasion have ever convinced them? In the immediate aftermath of the Quebec misadventure, the answer should have been obvious. But even after the American colonies secured their own independence with the Revolutionary War's end in 1783, they weren't dissuaded from trying to pull Canada into the Union. 38 years after the first failed invasion, in the second year of the War of 1812, American troops marched into Canada and burned down the Legislative Assembly in York, now Toronto. The attempt to seize British-held territory was once again pretty much a disaster from the beginning to the end, wrote historian Gordon S. Wood in the New York Review of Books in 2012. With the lessons of Quebec never truly learned, America's mistakes compounded. As Anderson argues in his book, American liberators sought to bring their own concepts of freedom to a foreign culture, to a people with a starkly contrasting worldview, and to a society inextricably welded to a seemingly antagonistic religion and lacking a tradition of popular rule. Whether Canadians ever would have joined the American Revolution en masse is doubtful, but invading Quebec as a persuasive tactic ultimately backfired on the Patriots. Defending Quebec forced French Canadians, British soldiers, and other loyalists to fight alongside one another. It's one of these early stages of what becomes modern Canadian identity, Taub explains. The American invasion seems to unify divided Canadians. After 250 years, that resolve appears to be unshaken.
The founding father who lost a leg, romanced married and single women alike, and escaped the bloodshed of the French Revolution. Gouverneur Morris wrote the preamble to the Constitution and shaped the future of the nascent United States. Later in life, he rejected the foundational document as a failure. Gouverneur Morris condensed and revised a draft of the United States Constitution, but he came to doubt his own words by the end of his life.
Some years passed, drives us rapidly toward a condition in which no human power can prevent these states from separating into two or more sections, independent of each other. I repeat it, fellow citizens, the Union is in danger. These cautionary words might call to mind Jefferson Davis and other Confederate leaders who tore the United States apart in the interest of preserving slavery. But these were not the fears and threats of a politician from Dixie. Instead, they were published in 1812 as a somber warning from a New York Federalist with unimpeachable qualifications to speak on matters regarding the U.S. Constitution. After all, he'd written it. That elder statesman was the ebullient Gouverneur Morris. It just so happened, however, that Morris's ire was directed at the only other person alive who could legitimately claim symbolic fatherhood of the Constitution, President James Madison. Than the most famous founding fathers, Morris wrote the American government into existence, but came to doubt his own words by the end of his life. He was a financial tinkerer who saw firsthand the detrimental effects of a weak federal government, a tried-and-true patriot whose family was torn apart by the American Revolution, and an avowed opponent of human bondage who nevertheless failed to incorporate anti-slavery language into the Constitution. Morris was also a prodigious lover, an unrepentant elitist, and one half of a bizarre yet tender high-profile marriage. And, for the most part, he undertook his work while navigating a significant disability. His left leg was amputated below the knee after a 1780 carriage accident. The towering, lusty Morris and the diminutive, solemn Madison had not always disagreed. In 1787, they were colleagues in Philadelphia,
where they labored together to condense the disparate voices at the Constitutional Convention into a manageable, unifying charter. The bookish James Wilson, a Scotsman who would be confined to debtor's prison twice while sitting on the Supreme Court before his death in 1798, delivered the most speeches at the convention, 172. Close behind him in loquacity were Morris, 171 speeches, and Madison, 167 speeches. Serving alongside Madison and Alexander Hamilton on the convention's 5-person Committee of Style, Morris had significantly condensed an unwieldy draft of the Constitution and written the preamble outright. Perhaps the 7 most famous words in American history came from Morris's mind. We, the people of the United States. Every bit as much as Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. Dennis C. Rasmussen, a political theorist at Syracuse University, tells Smithsonian Magazine. He single-handedly and rather radically reorganized the draft Constitution, consolidating 23 sprawling articles down to a neat 7, and he changed or chose a great deal of the wording of his own initiative, oftentimes in consequential ways. Madison himself acknowledged in an 1831 letter that the finish given to the style and arrangement of the Constitution fairly belongs to the pen of Mr. Morris. Nonetheless, Madison was more diligent than Morris in recording his thoughts. His posthumously published notes of debates in the Federal Convention of 1787 detailed the major discussions that went into creating the U.S. government. Madison also devised the Virginia Plan, which privileged larger, more populous states, and wrote 29 of the 85 Federalist Papers. The 4th president continued tinkering with his notes long after the Constitution had been ratified. As historian Mary Sarah Bilder writes in Madison's Hand, Revising the Constitutional Convention, Madison understood his revisions as repeated efforts to create a record, his record, of what he saw as significant in the convention. Yet each revision increased the distance between Madison's notes and the actual convention. Morris's contributions, on the other hand, were largely limited to the convention itself. He didn't produce an extensive collection of personal reflections on the 1787 proceedings. He didn't work on the Federalist Papers, despite Hamilton's efforts to recruit him. In fact, Madison was only chosen to contribute after Morris opted not to participate. By the turn of the 19th century, Morris believed he'd done his job and that he'd done it well. It was time for him to leave public service behind. Gouverneur Morris, young revolutionary. Born on January 31, 1752, Morris was descended from a line of prominent colonial political officials. His father's only son from his second marriage to Sarah Gouverneur knew from a young age that he would not inherit Morrisania, the family estate in New York. He had 3 older half-brothers with stronger claims to the land, among them a signer of the Declaration of Independence, a loyalist who would later serve as a member of Parliament and a New York judge. Though he lacked the sizable inheritance, Morris was born into a well-to-do family that provided the education, opportunity, and prestige necessary to make his later accomplishments possible. He enrolled in King's College, now Columbia University, at age 12, completed undergraduate and master's degrees by age 19, and read the law under the tutelage of the brilliant judge William Smith. When the American Revolution began in 1775, Morris was thrust into the throes of turmoil as an elected representative in the New York Provincial Congress and later the New York State Assembly. His position was challenging given the presence of loyalists in his life. As Morris prepared New York for the transition from colony to statehood, he watched Smith, his foremost legal mentor, struggle unsuccessfully to maintain neutrality. The jurist condemned colonists and the British Crown alike for their excesses. The British response to colonial discontent was utterly unjustifiable, Smith argued in 1780.
Nevertheless, it was the duty of the American assemblies to tender a plan to the mother country for restoring peace. Revolutionary fervor defined the moment. Smith would have to pick a side. He chose the crown and was eventually forced to flee the country because of it. In a bit of irony, Smith's other legal students, John Jay and Robert R. Livingston, joined Morris in supporting the Patriot cause. Divided on the question of independence. His loyalist half-brother, Stats Long, served in the British Army, and his mother donated the family estate to the British for military use after New York City fell in 1776. Morris and his half-brother Louis, on the other hand, helped initiate and establish an independent U.S. When warned by Stats Long that signing the Declaration of Independence would be treason, Louis supposedly retorted, "Damn the consequences. Give me the pen." Morris was appointed to the Continental Congress in January 1778. He missed adding his name to the Declaration by a year and a half, but was the youngest signer of the Articles of Confederation. After visiting Valley Forge during the winter of 1777 to 1778, he functionally became the Continental Army's spokesperson in Congress. As Morris reported in a letter, liberty and independence rested on the shoulders of a skeleton of an army in a naked, starving condition, out of health, out of spirits, without greater financial support and additional training for American troops. The Patriot cause would be lost. He believed, however, that replacing General George Washington with Horatio Gates, the commanding officer in the American victory at Saratoga, was not the answer. When a military junta sought to do just that, Morris wrote that a set of scoundrels were very busy in an attempt to ruin Washington's good name. Morris, who knew more about the state of the Army than most of his colleagues in Congress, defended the general. He even cast the tie-breaking vote to save Washington from a declaration of no confidence. New York did not re-elect Morris to Congress in 1779. Gouverneur Morris, state builder. In 1781, Morris accepted an appointed position in Congress as assistant to Robert Morris, no relation, the newly installed superintendent of finance. Known as the financier of the Revolution, the older, richer Robert drew heavily from his personal fortune to restore America's trade credibility and found the Bank of North America. Morris, meanwhile, took the lead in crafting policies regarding long-term economic growth. He drew up a plan for a national currency that used the words dollars and cents. No matter how much the pair tinkered, however, they realized that America's decentralized financial system wasn't sustainable. Significant reforms were needed. Sending Morris, a native New Yorker who was then living in Philadelphia, to represent the state at the 1787 Constitutional Convention. In addition to advocating for a strong executive and helping to design the Electoral College when his calls for direct elections sparked hostility, Morris was one of the group's most outspoken critics of human bondage. Born into a slave-holding family, he believed slavery was a nefarious institution, the curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed. On at least one occasion, however, Morris purchased 2 enslaved people whom he manumitted immediately, then bound to indentures for a set period of time. Despite Morris's objections, the convention ultimately enshrined the institution of slavery in the Constitution, albeit with the caveat that the transatlantic slave trade could be outlawed at the federal level starting in 1808. Given that he was forced to compromise on executive power, direct elections, slavery, and countless other aspects of the new government, Morris accepted the Constitution as the best possible document for the moment, but he thought it was by no means perfect.
Gouverneur Morris, European adventurer. Morris didn't have time to worry about the Constitution. His friend Robert Morris's finances were in shambles, and he had to travel to France to sort the situation out. Morris successfully calmed Robert's creditors, but the financier's land speculation was nowhere near profitable enough to remain solvent. Thus, Robert, once one of the wealthiest men in America, eventually found himself in a Philadelphia debtor's prison. Morris arrived in France in 1789 and remained there for the next 9 years. During this time, he saw firsthand the horrors of the French Revolution, lost friends and acquaintances to the guillotine, and briefly served as the U.S. Minister to France. Equipped with letters of introduction from Benjamin Franklin in Washington, he easily integrated into Paris's polite society. He even carried out a multi-year affair with author Adelaide Fillel, the wife of a high-ranking official in the French army. The guillotine became France's official method of capital punishment in spring 1792.
Though Jefferson was the American minister to France at the time, Morris's reputation as a writer of the Constitution preceded him. France was on the verge of its own revolution and was in desperate need of some advice. When Louis XVI summoned the Estates General in May 1789, Morris was happy to provide the assembly with guidance. But as historian Philip Zeitch, author of Cosmopolitan Patriots, Americans in Paris in the Age of Revolution, tells Smithsonian, Morris's advice concerning the need for a strong central government and a bicameral legislature that would balance the interests of different social classes was completely ignored. The political situation continued to deteriorate, and Morris, who was appointed minister plenipotentiary to France in 1792, had a front-row seat to the chaos. Later that year, the National Convention abolished the French monarchy. Revolutionaries executed Louis and his wife, Marie Antoinette, in 1793. French nobles of all stripes, including many of Morris's friends, lived in constant fear. Morris's lover, Fillel, escaped with her son. Her elderly husband didn't make it out. Morris witnessed it all. During the massacres of 1792, the American and the incredibly rich diary he kept during his time in Europe recounted how a female friend of Marie Antoinette was beheaded and disemboweled, the head and entrails paraded on pikes through the street, and the body dragged after them. Numerous other examples of mob violence appear in the diary. Even Morris himself was not always safe. When a hostile crowd surrounded him in Paris and threatened to hang him from a lamppost, he reportedly saved himself by removing his wooden leg, waving it aloft, and claiming to be an American patriot wounded in the cause of liberty. Still, Zeitch says, Morris decided to remain on his post after the fall of the monarchy, not only to help his aristocratic friends, but also because his departure would have called into question the Republic principle of popular sovereignty. He helped prominent figures escape France, gave nobles refuge in his home, and interceded with French officials on behalf of imprisoned colleagues. At the request of the French government, which viewed Morris as too hostile to the revolutionary cause, Washington recalled the diplomat in 1794. Gouverneur Morris, family man. Back in the U.S., the political climate was devolving into rigid factionalism between the Federalists and Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, ultimately culminating in the collapse of Federalist electability on the national stage in the election of 1800. The Virginia dynasty started by Jefferson continued under Madison and James Monroe, who collectively held the presidency for 24 years from 1801 to 1825. In allegiance and sensibility, Morris was a Federalist, a man of means who came to believe that the Constitution, as he'd written it, allowed the chief executive too much latitude to wage controversial wars and privilege some regions of the country over others. Elected to the U.S. Senate in 1800, Morris lost his bid for re-election in 1802. The age of Federalist power was over, and Morris found himself in a shriveling political minority. When he spoke on politics during the era of the Democratic-Republican juggernaut, it was as a critic. A 19th century photo of Gouverneur Morris's New York mansion. His public man to focus on private matters and local affairs. He'd purchased a portion of his family estate from his loyalist brother in 1787 and was the Morris of his own share of Morrisania. The only major milestones left in his life were perhaps the most daunting yet: marriage and fatherhood. He already had someone in mind, someone whose unfortunate situation might allow her to overlook his advancing age and missing leg. That woman was Anne Carey Randolph, more often called Nancy, whose young adulthood had been marred by allegations of adultery and child murder. After her fiancé died in 1792, Nancy grew unusually close to his brother, who was married to her sister. Later, two enslaved people found the corpse of a baby in a pile of shingles, sparking rumors that Nancy's brother-in-law had impregnated her and conspired with her to murder their child. Though the couple was brought to trial, neither was convicted. Nonetheless, Morris requested assurances from Nancy's former attorney, John Marshall, who was by then serving as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, that his prospective wife's reputation in Virginia was compatible with a man of his stature. Marshall replied that the circumstances surrounding the scandal were unambiguous. This assessment was good enough for Morris, who married Nancy in December 1809. Their only son, Gouverneur Jr., followed 4 years later. To improving New York State and New York City. He chaired the Erie Canal Commission between 1810 and 1813 and became one of the leading voices for New York City's potential as a financial powerhouse. He also helped draw up the Commissioner's Plan of 1811, an ambitious piece of urban planning that laid out Manhattan's street grid. But Morris couldn't be confined to his newfound life of domesticity and local politics. He was a man of action. The outbreak of the War of 1812 and the direction of the Madison administration were simply too much for him to bear in silence. By 1814, Morris was poised to throw in the towel on the American constitutional experiment. As biographer Richard Brookhiser argues, the man who wrote the Constitution judged it to be a failure and was willing to scrap it. Morris publicly supported the Hartford Convention, a gathering of Northern Federalists who met in Connecticut to condemn the War of 1812 and workshop solutions for their political isolation. While he never publicly urged New York and the New England states to secede, he was prepared to embrace the results of the Hartford Convention, whatever they might be. Ultimately, the signing of a treaty ending the war rendered the delegates' concerns irrelevant. By 1816, the once vibrant Morris was a gouty old man whose rambunctious romantic past all but guaranteed that he suffered from venereal disease. These long-standing infections, according to the Journal of Urology, likely caused urethral strictures or a narrowing of the urethra. Morris opted for self-treatment, including a homemade catheter. As a close friend lamented in a November 5 letter, Morris was not expected to live, as he'd unskillfully forced a piece of whalebone through the canal and so lacerated the parts as to create a very high degree of inflammation, which has been followed by a mortification that I am told will prove fatal. Morris died on November 6, 1816, at the age of 64.
Discover Patrick Henry's legacy beyond his revolutionary "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. Delivered 250 years ago, the famous oration marked the height of Henry's influence, but the politician also served in key roles in Virginia's state government after the American Revolution. Cassandra Goode, author, First Family, George Washington's Heirs, and the Making of America. A 19th century lithograph of Patrick Henry's "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. In a simple white church in Richmond, Virginia, tourists regularly fill the pews to hear a reenactment of a speech first given within the building's walls 250 years ago, on March 23, 1775. Here, with George Washington and Thomas Jefferson in the audience, Patrick Henry delivered an address to his fellow Virginia colonists, closing with the words that would make him famous: "Give me liberty or give me death." That line has echoed down through the centuries, a dramatic plea that Americans have used time and again to capture their commitment to freedom. But few Americans know much about Henry himself. Though Jefferson credited him as the man who gave the first impulse to the ball of revolution, Henry isn't one of the most prominent founding fathers. In part, that's because his 1775 speech marked the height of his influence in the American Revolution. He played a limited role in the actual fighting of the war and otherwise served largely in state rather than federal offices. He emerged again briefly as a key figure in the debate over the Constitution in the late 1780s, when he advocated for a Bill of Rights. But yet, by the time Henry died in 1799, he had so angered his partisan opponents that they resoundingly blocked a resolution paying tribute to him in the Virginia legislature. One of the challenges in getting to know Henry is that he left behind a limited paper trail. The bulk of Henry's known writings were published by his grandson in an 1891 volume, but historian Mark Cuvilon says that previously unknown correspondence continues to turn up for sale. And even though Henry was famed as an orator, no written accounts of his speeches survive from his lifetime. Scholars have to rely on recollections recorded years later by those in the audience. He was born in 1736 in Hanover County, Virginia, and underwent little formal schooling. At age 18, struggling to make ends meet as a merchant, he married 16-year-old Sarah Shelton. He then pivoted to law, studying only briefly before barely passing the bar exam in 1760. However, he quickly found success, particularly for his courtroom advocacy. It was not his knowledge of law, but rather his talent for public speaking that swayed judges and juries. His reputation as a lawyer is likely why leaders in his county selected him for a seat in the Virginia House of Burgesses in 1765, wrote historian Richard R. Beeman in his 1974 biography of Henry. Soon after taking his seat, Henry, by his own account, alone, unadvised, and unassisted, introduced resolutions opposing Great Britain's recent Stamp Act, which taxed paper goods like newspapers, playing cards, and legal documents. Henry's 5 resolutions rejected the Crown's right to unilaterally tax the American colonies. His speech defending the resolves was so fiery that some in the audience accused him of treason. But most of the delegates were persuaded and supported his resolutions. The resolves also inspired other colonies to take similar action. An 1851 painting of Patrick Henry speaking to the Virginia House of Burgesses. Henry was not very active in the House of Burgesses over the following decade, but he took on a greater role in the push for revolution beginning in 1773. He helped coordinate boycotts of British goods and was selected to represent Virginia at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in the fall of 1774.
The next spring, Henry arrived at the Second Virginia Convention in mourning for his recently deceased wife, but just as fiercely determined to fight for the colonies. To evade the royal governor in the colonial capital of Williamsburg, the group met at the largest public building in the then tiny town of Richmond, a 34-year-old Episcopal church now known as St. John's. The 120-odd delegates filled the pews as they deliberated over whether to raise troops against the British. Henry proposed resolutions on the need for defense, in part by establishing a militia in Virginia. His final resolution was very nearly a declaration of war, suggesting that a committee be convened to prepare a plan for embodying, arming, and disciplining such a number of men as may be sufficient for that purpose. It was in support of these resolutions that Henry rose to speak on March 23, 1775. He began, according to one observer, somewhat calmly. His practice was to start his orations softly and apologetically. He would then work up to a passionate, booming crescendo, his voice so loud it seemed to shake and rock the walls of the church, the observer added. Henry described the colony's grievances and colonists' many attempts at making peace, then concluded, "Gentlemen may cry peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war is actually begun." A born orator, Henry used his entire body as part of the performance. Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? He asked, while bending forward and crossing his wrists as if his hands were bound by manacles. Raising his invisibly chained hands up to the sky, he cried, "Forbid it, Almighty God." "I know not what course others may take," added Henry, his body straining against his imaginary chains and his voice rising. "But as for me, give me liberty or give me death." With these final words, he broke free from his imaginary chains and raised his hands, then motioned as if to stab his breast with a paper cutter clasped in his right hand. The audience sat in stunned silence as Henry took his seat. One delegate said the speech was one of the most bold, vehement, and animated pieces of eloquence that had ever been delivered. Another said his words had blazed so as to warm the coldest heart. Yet another said the delegates felt the echoes of that supernatural voice resonate through their bodies and that they became impatient of speech. Their souls were on fire for action. Henry's resolutions were approved, and he was appointed chair of a committee to organize the raising of militia companies across Virginia. Liberty or give me death. What was it in this speech that so moved the audience? It was not the logic of Henry's argument, or even the words he spoke. As fellow founder Jefferson said of the many times when Henry gave speeches opposing one of his ideas, "I myself had been highly delighted and moved, but I have asked myself when he ceased, 'What the devil has he said?' and could never answer the inquiry." One observer of the 1775 speech recalled decades later that voice, countenance, and gestures gave an irresistible force to his words, which no description could make intelligible to one who had never seen him nor heard him speak. With no recordings or even contemporary written accounts, historians can never know precisely what Henry looked and sounded like during his orations. They don't even know for sure what kind of accent Henry had. Historical interpreter Beau Robbins portrays Henry with an accent you can still find relics of in rural eastern pockets of Virginia. A lilt that sounds Canadian, but in fact derives from Scotland, where Henry's father was born. Robbins believes that Henry's gradually escalating tone meant that as his audience would be enraptured, he had the freedom to build and get louder and more firm in his tone. An illustration of George Washington, center, Patrick Henry, right, and Edmund Pendleton, left, riding to Philadelphia to attend the First Continental Congress.
Henry's performance animated ideas that took on new urgency with his voice. His words clearly echoed language from the Bible, which he read regularly, as well as texts like the speeches of Greek orator Demosthenes and Joseph Addison's play Cato, which features the line, "It is not now time to talk of aught, but chains or conquest, liberty or death." Revolutionaries often quoted Cato, which was performed regularly in the colonies, and the juxtaposition of liberty and death seems to have permeated American culture. In 1774, Abigail Adams wrote a friend that the only alternative which every American thinks of is liberty or death. Since no contemporaneous accounts of Henry's speech survive, historians cannot be entirely certain that he used the exact phrase, "give me liberty" or "give me death," or whether this was the invention of a later biographer. But Cuvion, who has written extensively on the Founding Father, finds the evidence that the famous quote was indeed Henry's convincing. He went on to have a distinguished career in Virginia state politics, including serving 5 one-year terms as governor. His most important legacy, however, is clearly the words he spoke in that Richmond church in 1775. After the speech was published in William Wirt's 1817 biography of Henry, it entered Americans' public consciousness. The phrase was particularly popular in anti-slavery circles and among enslaved people themselves. Henry had, after all, invoked slavery as the alternative to fighting for liberty, despite the fact that he himself was an enslaver. As Matthew J. Clavin shows in his book, Symbols of Freedom, Slavery and Resistance Before the Civil War, newspapers in the mid-19th century chronicled the stories of enslaved people who died by suicide after repeating Henry's cry, as well as those fleeing from slavery who credited him as an inspiration. For instance, the Virginian William P. Newman, who escaped to Ohio, wrote, "I am proud to say that Patrick Henry's motto is mine." An anti-slavery poster that features Henry's "Give me liberty or give me death" line. Abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison took up Henry's phrase in a speech at a gathering to commemorate John Brown, who led the violent anti-slavery raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. Who instigated John Brown? Garrison asked. Let us see. It must have been Patrick Henry, who said, and he was a Virginian, "Give me liberty or give me death." As Frederick Douglass noted in a June 1854 newspaper editorial, however, many Americans praised Henry's phrase and the violent rebellion against British oppression while simultaneously decrying violent resistance to slavery. Black activists continued to claim Henry's mantle in the 20th century. When Marcus Garvey appealed to Congress in 1919 to argue against the Constitution of the League of Nations, which gave European powers the right to control African countries, he quoted the famous phrase and asked, "Will you deny the native Africans of the spirit of a Patrick Henry?" More ominously, Black nationalist leader Malcolm X said in 1964 that the struggle for civil rights had reached a dangerous inflection point. It'll be ballots or it'll be bullets. It'll be liberty or it will be death. Malcolm X was assassinated the following year. Henry's speech has also been cited regularly in protests. In 2020, a New York Times photographer captured a snapshot of a woman upset about COVID-19 public health measures. She stood outside of a Baskin-Robbins with a poster emblazoned, "Give me liberty or give me death." In 2022, Chinese protesters objecting to their country's zero-COVID policy also used the phrase. This wasn't the first time Henry's words appeared in China. Pro-democracy demonstrators held posters with the phrase at Tiananmen Square in 1989. Part of the power of Henry's phrase is the multiplicity of meanings people have found in the word liberty. For Henry, liberty in the context of his speech meant breaking free from the oppression of British control.
After the American Revolution, he remained suspicious of centralized government power in the nascent United States. For enslaved people and abolitionists, liberty was the state of owning one's own body. And for the woman protesting pandemic restrictions, liberty was about removing the government from decisions about exposing oneself and others to a potentially lethal illness. As gay rights activist Harvey Milk argued in 1978, Henry was talking about political liberty, but there is a more personal type, a more important type. Milk added, "If you are not personally free to be yourself in that most important of all human activities, the expression of love, then life itself loses its meaning." The fact that Henry's short phrase, spoken 250 years ago this month, could inspire activists across the political spectrum and even the world is a testament to the power of those simple words. The man whom Jefferson called the greatest orator that ever lived, lives on with words that speak to Americans' enduring struggles for freedom.